We're going to start on this show talking about the spending review yesterday. Rachel Reeves' big moment for the government. It's going to set the terms of good departmental spending over this Parliament. So lots of questions about what actually was in there if you look into the meat of the statement, and we're going to look at that.
It's always a question with spending reviews and budgets. What is the day two story? What happens the morning after? The Institute for Fiscal Studies are doing their presentation on all the facts and figures as we speak. But luckily, they sent us over their slides and Paul Johnson's opening statement. So we're right up to date. But of course, the other news this morning was the monthly GDP figures. The output of the economy actually shrank in April by 0.3%. After a strong first quarter, the economy's gone back into reverse. And we're going to talk second about the wider economic and political context in which this spending review has to be seen and how things are going to develop between now and the budget. But we're going to start with the spending review. Yesterday, Rachel Reeves announced in last year's budget the overall path for public spending for the next 3-4 years. And what she did yesterday was announce the Treasury's allocations to departments for next year, the year after, and the year after that, all the way up to 2028, 29. And before we get into the wider economics and politics of this, we thought we should unpack what these figures are actually kind of telling us. What are the numbers that she announced? I think we should start with a little bit of Rachel Reeves in the House of Commons. And then we're going to hear from what will be, I think, a much missed voice in British politics. But first of all, Rachel Reeves.
My driving purpose since I became Chancellor is to make working people in all parts of our country better off, to rebuild our schools and our hospitals, to invest in our economy so that everyone has the opportunity to succeed after 14 years of mismanagement and decline by the party opposite. Defence spending will now rise to 2.6% of GDP by April 2027, including the contribution of our intelligence agencies. A new affordable homes programme in which I am investing £39 billion over the next decade. We are investing £7 billion to fund 14,000 new prison places and putting up to £700 million per year into reform of the probation system too. I am providing investment rising to nearly £2.3 billion per year to fix our crumbling classrooms. In addition, £2.4 billion per year to continue our programme to rebuild 500 schools and to make sure that the NHS is there whenever we need it. I am proud to announce today that this Labour government is making a record cash investment in our National Health Service, increasing real terms day-to-day spending by 3% per year for every single year of this spending review.
Lots of figures, lots of billions. Paul Johnson from the IFS, his first reaction after the speech was that it was incomprehensible, very hard to work out what was really going on. Paul is standing down after 13 years as the director of the IFS, and I think this is the last big kind of fiscal economic event he's going to be covering. So we thought we should give you Paul Johnson's first reaction to Rachel Reeves' statement.
Chancellor today unveiled her spending review. What she didn't do was tell us how much money she's going to spend. She told us that all the way back in the autumn. What she did was give us some idea where that money is going to be allocated over the next 3 years. As we expected, the big winner here is the National Health Service, 3% a year increases in spending on that. The consequence is there's not much left over for most other bits of government. An average overall of 1.2% a year increases. Once you give 3% to the NHS, that's pretty much nothing on average for other bits of government.
We wish Paul well, and we will miss him on days like this. But Ed, so this, I mean, he's making the point, this isn't a budget in the sense that we didn't get a forecast on the economy, we didn't get any tax measures. But in many ways, it's more important than your regular budget because it's going to set spending for departments over the next few years. We're going to get into all the kind of details of it in a moment. But what was your overall impression? What was she trying to achieve, and did she succeed?
Well, the numbers which she inherited when she became Chancellor last summer were of public spending, which had been rising quite quickly in the last 2 or 3 years of the Conservative government after the pandemic, and then suddenly went into basically flatlining in the next 2 or 3 years. That was the Jeremy Hunt inheritance that she picked up. Those were the figures that Paul Johnson and others said were fantasy figures. And what she's done as Chancellor is carried on that rising profile for public spending, although it's rising quite quickly last year and this year, and then the growth rates slow down quite a lot. So that by the time you get to 28, 29, much slower growth in public spending. Overall, there's a lot of capital spending. Capital spending is rising quite fast, continuing the growth rates we've seen in recent years. Current spending, much tighter. As Paul Johnson says in his press conference today, it's not austerity overall, but the large bulk of the public spending increases goes to the health department and to defence as well. And therefore, for lots of other government departments, spending settlements, as Paul said, are going to be very tight indeed. And if you look down the list of the winners and losers, clearly health, social care get the biggest increase. That's all the NHS rather than social care, followed by defence. But once you get down to budgets like DCMS, museums, libraries, local government, farmers, rural communities, the non-police Home Office, the Cabinet Office, the Foreign Office, those are departments which are going to be having real-term cuts. And for a lot of those departments, it's going to feel like austerity is continuing.
Yeah, I've got an interesting observation, which I think neither political party will agree with because it's not in their interest, which is that, frankly, this is continuity Sunak. This is a rather technocratic statement from a government that is not delivering a kind of radical change in how the country is governed. That the big increases in spending from the austerity period over which I prescribed, over which I presided, in fact started under the Boris Johnson government. And what Rachel Reeves is doing is continuing the increase in the size of the state and the increase in the tax burden that Boris Johnson and Sunak started. And if you look at departmental spending, you can get into kind of all the kind of details of it. So if you look at departmental spending over this parliament, according to the IFS, it's going to be 2.3% in real terms. Under the last parliament, it was actually much more. It was over 3%. Capital spending increasing at 2.6%. It increased at 2.5% in the last Tory period. Now, that bunch of Tories don't want to admit that they were increasing the size of the state, increasing taxes, and it was bigger government. And this Labour government wants to say it's making a big change and a big break from the Tory years. But if you look at the kind of overall spending numbers, and indeed, you know, Paul Johnson says today in the press conference, he's actually giving, while we do this podcast, but he's sent us his remarks in advance. He says the real achievement of this government is to maintain the high levels of spending the last government reached. And no one in the political system wants to admit that because it's not in anyone's interest. But that's what's happening. And the central question, which I think faced the last Conservative government, which is how on earth are you going to pay for this all? And Rachel Reeves says there was a black hole because they didn't have an answer, is going to be the same question that comes to this government. And so that you know, in amongst all of the numbers, and it's quite continuity. It's not particularly exciting. It's not particularly radical. It's not a break from the past. It's more of the same.
Of course, within those numbers, under the last Conservative government and then this Labour government, quite a big increase in capital spending, much tighter current spending than, for example, you saw in the Labour government of Blair and Brown. Much higher expenditure on debt interest payments, which takes up a lot of that uplift in overall public spending. Of course, a lot of spending on incapacity and welfare compared to the past, which is taking on quite a lot of that spending. But if you go back to, to your point about Rishi Sunak and the struggles he had, and then you think about this spending review. I mean, Rishi Sunak really struggling with very high waiting times in the National Health Service, really struggling with his cabinet colleagues pressing him to raise defence spending, and him trying to do that and finding it difficult to do, really struggling with kind of crime and law and order, trying to get police numbers up. And then you think about what is going on in this spending review. I mean, I think it's a really dangerous, but we all do it, to kind of fall into the who are the winners and who are the losers, because actually the departments which look like the winners may actually going to be some of the departments which cause the greatest challenges for this government over the next 2 or 3 years, because the growth rates don't tell you what the need is, what the economic or political expectation is. This is a point actually made by Sam Friedman in his Substack this morning, which is really worth reading. If you look at the NHS, for example, the big winner from this spending review, but also the thing which, in terms of waiting times, the government is massively exposed on, they're delivering growth for the National Health Service of 3% a year. The historical average is 3.6%. So this is below average spending in the post-World War period. If you look at the period when Labour really got waiting times down aggressively after 2001-2 with the national insurance tax rise, at that time, NHS spending was rising by 6% a year plus. I mean, over twice the increases we're going to see here. So the NHS has taken 90% of that uplift in public spending. That's what the Resolution Foundation say. Increasingly dominant in overall departmental spending. But the question for Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer when it comes to the politics of the next election is it enough? Is it actually going to get waiting times falling as opposed to simply static when you're delivering an NHS uplift which is below the historical average at a time when drug prices are rising, waiting times are still high, so much of the money has been absorbed in public sector pay. The same thing applies with defence. I mean, it is true the big difference of this spending review to Conservative spending review is normally under the Conservatives defence spending goes down. It's rising as a percentage of GDP here, but it's rising to 2.5% at a time when the defence review is saying it needs to be 3%. And NATO says no, it needs to be 3.5.
Trump says it needs to be 5.
Trump says it needs to be 5. And almost all of the money in this defence settlement, which is mainly capital, is going to be spent on existing defence plans which have already been announced are running over budget. So it's not clear there's much money in here for more troops, let alone the new equipment which the Defence Department would like to hire. So the two winners look actually under quite a lot of pressure, and that's before you start talking about the people who we call the losers.
No, this is definitely not the sort of mid-Blair Brown period when, which of course you were very involved in, where they turn the spending taps on for the public sector. I think for most departments, it's going to still feel very tight, especially the departments where real budgets are being squeezed. But as you say, in health, the pressure on the health service at the moment, remains. Continues to grow at an almost exponential rate. A lot of this extra money is going to be absorbed in pay settlements and workforce growth. There's a workforce plan. There's still a threat of a doctor strike out there, and they're way off the targets. And again, compare it to the so they're getting 2.7% day-to-day budget growth over this whole parliament, over inflation. But, it's not so different. It was 2.3% over the Conservative period. It's not like a huge change. And I thought the other kind of interesting point overall about the spending review is and I actually think it's quite a good thing for our country, but I wouldn't necessarily feel this way if I was a Labour MP. It's quite technocratic. There's not that much sort of political imagination here. The money is going on defence. Okay, great, but we need not great. Sadly, the world is dangerous, and we do need to spend more money. But that's not going to deliver a lot of votes for Labour MPs in their constituencies. The money is going on a big new nuclear power station in Suffolk. Absolutely needed, long overdue. Recent Conservative Prime Ministers talked about nuclear and weren't able to deliver new nuclear projects.
Prison building,
but. And a lot of the kind of expenditure, which we haven't seen all of the details of, because I think next week we're getting the kind of national infrastructure review coming up. But seems to be investment in transport and rail that is attempting to improve the productivity of the economy. That's fantastic. This is not what the Tories in the later years were trying to do, which was the sort of levelling up, spending it all on the tarting up the town centres of marginal seats. So I applaud money for defence, money for nuclear power, money for important transport improvements, particularly in the north of England. But it's not a kind of political game changer. And I don't think today, the Labour government, if you're sitting there, is in a completely different political environment than the one it was 24 hours ago, obviously.
And a few things to watch as this unfolds. I mean, there's been obviously a huge amount of noise from the police, who are saying that this is not going to mean more police officers, it's going to mean less, and doubting whether the government's commitment to 13,000 more neighbourhood police officers can actually be delivered. Council tax rises, seemingly baked in year...
To pay for the police numbers.
Well,
to pay for the assumptions on police numbers. Yes.
And but also for the local government numbers. And the local government numbers, I think, it looks like local government isn't doing as badly as some departments, but they are so under pressure on children's services and social care. So is there enough money to keep local government from not becoming a noisy item for the government over the next year? The education...
Just on council tax, before we move on, I think it's a classic... I think there is an echo of the Blair government where there was a kind of assumption you could get away with kind of increases in council tax and no one would notice. And like always with tax, if you over-rely on one tax, suddenly the kind of elastic band snaps. And I remember in the kind of mid to late Blair period, suddenly council tax increases became politically very contentious, and as a Conservative opposition we promised to freeze council tax, which was like what oppositions do when something like that happens. And so assuming that because the council tax kind of dog hasn't barked in recent years it won't do in the future is, at least you're running quite a risk.
Not least because this is clearly where reform thinks it can make political traction in the local elections next year and the year after. Then you look at education, a tight settlement for education, a lot of that money going in free school meals, which is good.
That was the only really big... I mean, I know it was announced last week. To me, that's the only really big new thing that this spending review delivered that's really kind of consumer-facing and that I can get my head around and means a great deal to, of course, to parents with children who are going to be eligible.
But you have huge pressure on special needs spending. Pupil numbers are falling, but it's not clear yet. I don't think we know this yet. Does this mean per pupil spending is going to continue to rise? Is it going to be flat? Could it fall? I think that education budget is definitely something to watch. It's
not an education spending review.
Definitely not.
I mean, she said in the clip we had of Rachel Reeves, she says it's for schools and hospitals, but it's much more for hospitals and schools, to be honest, this spending review.
And the schools stuff is going on, big expansion of free school meals, but not necessarily on teachers' numbers or teaching assistants. It's a 3-year spending review.
Anything else, just before we move off the departments, I just kind of highlight a couple others. DEFRA, farmers. I mean, farmers have been hit by, the wealthier farmers have been hit by the inheritance tax changes. But this is an assault on the countryside payments they get for managing the landscape. I personally think this was inevitable after Brexit. That once farmers came off the common agricultural policy, which governments like the French and Spanish governments insisted were very high, and once you had British governments in charge of this, the money was going to be squeezed, whoever was in power, frankly. And so the farmers who voted for Brexit, I'm afraid they're a bit like the turkeys who suddenly discover it's the 25th of December. On the other department, I don't really understand the politics of this at all, and I declare an interest as someone involved with the British Museum. But why would you squeeze DCMS and the culture budget? It's a rounding error for the Treasury. Tiny, tiny sums, but a noisy stakeholder group, many of whom have been very supportive of the Labour movement over the years. And, these are going to be cuts in institutions and arts organisations that do a huge amount, not just to, support the creative industries and bring tourists to Britain, but actually do a huge amount to regenerate communities around the country. So I thought that's a bit... It doesn't make any difference to the Treasury numbers. It makes a big difference to the sector.
And talking about culture, Foreign Office getting kind of really hit. 5% real terms cuts over the full period. Within that, is the BBC World Service going to continue to be funded well? They fought off cuts last autumn. We will find out in the coming weeks whether they're going to survive that as well. All things to kind of watch. The big winners were economic capital spending, not actually public service capital, not really schools and hospitals, but local transport, the energy and green investment. And
yeah, your friend Ed Miliband, he came out fairly unscathed, didn't he? A winner.
Rachel,
I don't remember him being a massive fan of big nuclear power stations back in the day, but he is now.
But then the reason is Rachel Reeves is needing growth.
No, I would applaud the focus on, in as much this is not an exact science, and economists of great repute will disagree about what is the most effective way to spend public money, but in kind of orthodox terms, there is a direction of money towards the things that people think is going to lead to higher growth and a more productive economy. And the kind of question is going to be, how quickly can the money be got out the door? Can the planning laws be changed fast enough to make it happen? Because even on housing, which we haven't mentioned, but there's an increase in the social housing budget, that comes at a time when planning permissions for new housing in the last 3 months have hit a 13-year low. So it's quite sort of, it's all very well kind of allocating the money, being there, the Chancellor at the dispatch box. If you have an economic growth-focused programme, you've got to make sure that the money actually reaches the front line. I mean, that's a good moment, isn't it, to turn to what's the overall economic message of the government? Where does this spending review sit in that? And what did we learn about Rachel Reeves as a Chancellor from her performance yesterday? And we're going to turn to that next. I remember when we discussed last week the spending review, we anticipated that when the Chancellor was at the dispatch box, a lot of numbers would be thrown around and it would sound like a lot of money was being spent. And if you're sitting there as an MP, whether it's a government MP or an opposition MP, it's extremely hard to work out what's actually going on. You have to wait for the IFS to tell you, or the Resolution Foundation, or whoever to tell you. And the normal reaction after a Chancellor speaks is for the party to rally round. And she seems to have had a good performance and a good reception, crucially, at the Parliamentary Labour Party meeting that happened afterwards. But what were your thoughts about her performance in the chamber, and in particular how she sort of structured her speech and the language she used?
I think it was very hard to understand what was going on, but the overall impression that she wanted to convey in the House of Commons to her own side really was that I am delivering, that this is a Labour programme.
When you say I, you mean very specifically Rachel Reeves?
I, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, am delivering. Forget all this stuff about me being forced into U-turns. I am delivering. This is a Labour programme of spending for our manifesto priorities. I mean, just listen to how she ended the speech.
These are my choices, Mr. Speaker. These are Labour choices. These are the choices of the British people, and I commend this statement to the House.
Shudder, Chancellor, Mel Stride.
And the very striking thing, I mean, I've not done the numbers on this, but she used the word I a lot of times, a lot more than I think a Chancellor normally would. I mean, and
you might be thinking I, but you use the word we. Do you? I seem to remember. I definitely used to think I'm the one putting in all the effort here, but I better talk about we.
But she was saying, stick with me. I am delivering, and I think that the reaction she got in the House of Commons and in the Parliamentary Labour Party in the evening meeting afterwards would have been strong and supportive. But I also thought, though, that it was a real gamble that she took, and it was a surprising communication decision. I mean, she could have said, on the one hand, growth is returning, there are sunny uplands, we are turning the corner, we are delivering, but it's going to be hard. The global environment's difficult. we haven't got the growth coming through strongly yet. I've got to make tough choices. I'm sorry, some departments are going to see real-term cuts. That is the price we pay for our long-term plan. She didn't really do any of the latter. It was all on the we're through, we're delivering, growth is here. That argument that she and Keir Starmer have made, which we were sceptical about last week, the reason why we can restore the winter allowance is because we've dealt with the black hole. The economy's back. We've got our trade deals. The fiscal situation is improving, and therefore we can afford it. And that all depends upon it turning out to be true that the economy is strengthening and the fiscal position is getting better. And she didn't give herself really kind of any insurance against that. And I guess the thing which concerns me is that there is a strength that she's seeking through a stubbornness. I will prevail. This is the same kind of view which said last autumn, I've raised taxes and those are all the tax rises I'll need for the Parliament. These are my fiscal rules and they are non-negotiable. These are our spending plans and they are affordable. And the problem between now and the budget is growth going to be stronger or weaker? It actually fell on the last monthly figures. Is she on track for her fiscal rules, or is the OBR going to say she's off track? She's got welfare reforms, which she says she's not going to back down on, but lots of MPs think she's going to. She's got to pay for the winter fuel allowance U-turn, and what's going to happen on the two-child policy. And if she's not changing the fiscal rules, and these public spending plans are now set in stone and they're pretty tight, and she's not going to raise taxes anymore because she said she's not going to, and she's not building any insurance into her communication, where's the give going to come from? I sort of feel as though there are clearly people in the Treasury who said to her, to be strong, you mustn't U-turn on the winter allowance. The same people are saying, to be strong, you mustn't give any inch to doubt or concern about the growth plan and the fiscal path this year. But she's so boxed in that all depends upon outcomes and events of which now they have no control. I mean, between now and the budget, what is her room for manoeuvre?
Yeah, I mean, I think the language around I and the emphasis solely on all the kind of public expenditure goodies without setting it in the context of difficult decisions and, a very uncertain economic environment probably speaks to some insecurity, an insecurity about her own political position because, for what it's worth, those polls done of Labour members say she's the most unpopular member of the cabinet. It's not a bad place necessarily for a chancellor to be if you're doing things that are difficult and against the grain of what the party wants to hear, but you are confident are going to deliver the results. Maybe an insecurity in number 10 Downing Street, that while their foreign policy programme is looking much stronger these days, Keir Starmer strikes a good figure on the international stage. Domestically, he's not cutting through in the way that he would like. And there's an insecurity too about their political opponents, not the Conservative Party, but Reform. I mean, there were quite a few mentions of Nigel Farage in the speech itself, which, I guess is pretty revealing. So I guess there's an insecurity about the way you present it. I thought she's still not doing, and this would apply equally to number 10, there's still not a clear slogan or narrative. If I listened to her Today programme interview this morning, and that's the bit, there were lots of other interviews done this morning, but the Today programme one is the longest and often in some ways the hardest. And I was trying to think, what is the one slogan that she's trying to ram down shove into my ears since I was listening to it on my headphones. I couldn't detect where's the long-term economic plan. Where's the no more boom and bust? Where's the sort of slogan that you get a bit sick and tired of, but at least the government's communicating to you. I couldn't even detect what it was, and I'm quite attuned to these things compared to most people. And finally, this is all being done within the constraints of a fiscal envelope set out in the budget that are required to meet the fiscal rules. And we talked again in the previous podcast about you can turn that into economic stability that's delivering lower mortgage rates than would otherwise be the case for homeowners, and avoiding, the kind of Liz Truss disaster. That's the kind of political way to package that. And you could make that a big part of a spending review, even if it's only a spending review, not a budget. And again, that wasn't happening either. And I guess my sort of final observation, therefore, is it opens the door to the counterattack, which is you're spending today, but you're going to tax tomorrow. And I thought the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride, did a pretty good job of landing a slogan. It's hard. You and I have both done this, the Shadow Chancellor on spending review days. It's not an easy job to do. You have to get up and give an immediate response. And you have to show you're on top of your brief and have got some salient points to make. But the main thing you're trying to do is land a slogan. And the, spend today, tax tomorrow was something that Mel Stride effectively landed, and we should just listen to him do it in the House of Commons.
This spending review is not worth the paper that it is written on, because the Chancellor has completely lost control. This is the spend now, tax later review.
The reason I think why that succeeded is partly because it was a good line, but I do think it's because she left him that space. She wasn't putting in place the warnings, the kind of the global challenges, the importance of staying with tough decisions for the long term. And as a consequence, because she sounded like it was all fine and now she can spend, it opens up that space for Mel Stride. By the way, if there's one lesson the Conservative Party should take from today is let the Shadow Chancellor do the morning round, including the Today programme, because the Leader of the Opposition should never be on the Today programme at 7:30. They should always be at 8:10. They should never be on the same day as the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And, I thought Emma Barnett gave Kemi Badenoch no chance to answer a single question in that interview. I thought it was very hard on Kemi Badenoch, but she also had no message. She wasn't really delivering the Mel Stride message. Mel Stride would have done a much better job than Kemi Badenoch this morning. But it goes back to that big point.
I don't think either the interviewer nor the interviewee would regard that as a great interview.
It was a catastrophe, a mutual catastrophe. But it goes back to this bigger point, which is it's important to be an iron chancellor. But the thing about iron is that it's a malleable metal. You have to be able to
well, only when you heat it up a lot.
Well, but you have to be able to stick to your long-term course,
yes,
but be able to bend in the face of global challenges and headwinds. And if you have a fiscal rule which is set over the economic cycle and the growth is weaker, that buys you some more time to meet your fiscal rules. If you set them according to the calendar year, much harder to change course. If you say, I'm not going to raise taxes, I've done my tax raising for the Parliament, that's fine, unless you have to raise a tax. And this is not a spending review where when you look at it, we discussed it a moment ago, you don't look at this and think the pressure is going to be downwards. I mean, there's going to be lots of issues over the course of the next 6 months and beyond before you start talking about the winter allowance or two-child policy or what's happening to the pace of the uplift in defence spending, where people will be saying, are they actually delivering the spending to meet their objectives? I mean, there was almost no mention of the government's missions in that spending review statement, but these are missions which are in the manifesto. So Rachel Reeves thinks she's getting strength from deliberately boxing herself in, but that depends now on a whole series of domestic and global events, long-term interest rates, growth, Trump, all of which are outside her control. And, everybody else who watches this economically says the only thing which she'll be able to move on is tax. And did she prepare the ground for that yesterday? Not at all.
No, I think that's right. In some ways, the real world intruded, didn't it, immediately after the spending review. When we woke up this morning, the day two headlines were those GDP numbers you mentioned showing the economy contracted in April.
And they would have known that the GDP number was coming out the day after the spending review when they announced the date on Spring Statement Day. I don't know about you. We would never have chosen to do a spending review on a budget when there was a big number the next day, which we couldn't know and could go the wrong way. But, maybe they rolled the dice back in March and thought, growth, it'll be good.
Or maybe they thought it's a monthly figure, but nevertheless, you wake up this morning to headlines that the economy was contracting, and it is worth noting that the backdrop continues to be, at best sluggish and at worst somewhat worrying. It is at the moment unemployment is rising in the UK, and that's quite a marked development that should be potentially a warning signal of worse times to come. And the borrowing costs for the UK are now higher than they were when Liz Truss was Prime Minister, albeit in the context of higher borrowing costs around the world, but the highest in the G7. So it remains a kind of very difficult economic backdrop. And I do worry from her point of view and the government's point of view that, I applaud the spending review for focusing on economic development. But if it's all taking place against a drumbeat that there are further tax rises coming, and they're coming in the autumn, whatever she said about no more tax rises, that's going to be quite a pull on investment. Because I think the business community is probably going to assume, well, they're not going to be targeted on the general public, these tax rises. They'll find another way to clobber business. And there's still not enough in the government's message that is sort of pro-enterprise, pro-the entrepreneur, the kind of things that Gordon Brown and Tony Blair did to win over the business community all those years ago with the last time there was a Labour government.
And then on the other side of the ledger, Labour MPs worrying about the two-child policy and child poverty, which will cost, but also the welfare reforms. The Treasury, on page 25, produces a very good impact of decisions, the distributional impact by decile.
I think you'll find I was the first Chancellor to publish that.
No, we did it.
No, I promise you.
By decile?
I used to.
The distributional impact.
I used to publish. This was an innovation of the Osborne Chancellor.
I think you were the first Conservative Chancellor to publish it, but we absolutely.
I was the first Conservative Chancellor after you.
Because we absolutely published it because we would show the progressive nature of our tax and benefit changes.
You stopped publishing it as the global crash took hold.
I can't comment on what happened after 2007. I just know what happened 10 years before. However,
there was a Labour government for the 3. You were in the cabinet.
The striking thing in this chart is how regressive the welfare reforms are. The biggest hit in the poorest second, third and fourth decile. So the people with below average incomes hit much harder than.
But they would be by welfare changes, wouldn't they? I mean because that's where welfare goes. What
I'm saying is it increases the pressure. The other thing
were you surprised in the statement there was not more on welfare? I think we had anticipated there would be more on welfare in the statement than there was. I mean, they'd done the winter fuel payment U-turn. I'm told, maybe true, may not be, we'll find out, that number 10 was somewhat blindsided by the way that Rachel Reeves then announced the details of that. Said because she'd been blindsided by Keir Starmer announcing it at PMQs.
They didn't, and in passing, they didn't do what we said. We said, do it clean. Just say, look, we did this and it didn't work. And we've listened and we've made the change. And instead, the explanation is because growth is stronger, we can now afford not to do it, which of course means if growth isn't stronger in the autumn or next year, other Conservatives or Reform going to say, well, in that case, they'll be planning to take the winter fuel allowance away again. I mean,
the poor ministers wrigling in the interviews when they were confronted. What do you mean the economy is stronger?
Just say you got it wrong and move on.
But why didn't the government? Why didn't Downing Street numbers 10 and 11 backtrack on the disability cuts? There's been a lot of trailing of that. And why did they park the two-child policy? Are they saving that up for the budget?
I think because the Chancellor wanted to say, I set the envelope in last year's budget. This is not a fiscal event. This is simply the allocation of something which has been declared to be affordable. And the moment she starts raising changes in the welfare reforms or changes in the two-child policy.
But she did winter fuel payment.
But But she didn't do it in the spending statement. She did it 2 days before on Monday to try and get it out of the way. It's not something which is paid for in this statement. And I think the moment you open that up, you also open up the question of what's happening to the fiscal rules, what's happening to growth, what's happening to tax. I think they wanted to keep it as narrow as they could. But I agree with you that in terms of preparing for tough decisions in the autumn, that's where I would have been on that broader agenda, but they chose not to do that, and there we are. It means that this is going to be a very, very challenging few months between now and the budget, and it's just hard to see now what levers the Treasury's got.